Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. I'm Ian Willoughby. My guest in this episode is Jitka Pánek Jurková, who this time last year was appointed director of the Czech Centres network. When we spoke at the organization's HQ on Prague's Wenceslas Square, I was interested in what more the Czech Centres can do to boost Czechia's international image and how decisions are made on opening or closing branches. But I also wanted to find out a little bit about Jitka herself, including her own experience of heading a Czech Centre and about her podcast on cultural diplomacy with the fascinating title of Jazz Artist versus Spies. And you can hear my chat with Jitka Pánek Jurková now in this edition of Prague Talk. My first question, what led you to the field you work in today?
I've always been really passionate about two things: international relations and arts history. And throughout my middle school, I was deliberating which of these fields I should choose. And one day I read this amazing article in the magazine Mezinárodní politika, International Politics, by Eliška Tomalová, now a very close friend and colleague of mine, about the magnificent notion of cultural diplomacy. And for me, this really was the eureka moment, because it's like, I can do both. I can actually combine it. So I did.
I'm sure many of our listeners and readers have been to Czech Centres. They know what you do. But for those who haven't, in a nutshell, what's the mission of the Czech Centres network?
The mission really is to gain sympathies and positive emotional response for Czechia in support of Czech foreign policy. So Czech Centres is the same system or the same institutions as Germany has the Goethe Institute, as France has the Institut Français, as Britain has the British Council, obviously. It's a tool of so-called soft power, meaning really communicating with foreign audiences.
You have new Czech Centres opened relatively recently in Taipei, Belgrade and Hanoi. On what basis were those places chosen as good locations for new Czech Centres?
Just for their relevance for Czech foreign policy and its goals. Taipei, I think, is pretty obvious. Taiwan has been a very important strategic partner with growing importance. Belgrade, as a capital of Serbia, is also a really thrilling territory to be at because it's a geostrategically very important place. Czechia has a very strong relationship with Serbia, and on the grounds of negotiation of former Czech President Miloš Zeman and current Serbian President Vučić, we got this really wonderful building in the center of Belgrade. Hanoi has a very specific link, right, to Czechia. Historically, there is a very strong community of young people linked to Czechia. And once again, the geostrategic importance and importance for Czech investors, private sector there is also paramount.
Well, these decisions seem so important. Do they come straight from the top, from the foreign minister himself?
Well, there always obviously is a discussion between the foreign minister and the directorship of the Czech Centres. But yes, it would be the decision on the level of the foreign minister.
Conversely, you're also closing some Czech Centres in Athens and Rotterdam. On what basis are those decisions taken? I know some people have started petitions calling for them to be preserved.
I am actually happy to see the petitions because it means that our agenda is perceived as an important one. And I'm really glad that it is perceived as such. On the other hand, I am not only in a position of a strategist of our institution, but also of a person responsible for a chapter of state budget, right? Part of state budget. And the budget remains relatively the same, more or less, whereas our agendas and our responsibilities in other regions grow. My motto, in general, is quality over quantity, right? And here we needed to make some choices. On a personal level, of course, it's sad. Me personally, I studied at the University of Amsterdam. I have a very strong relationship towards the Netherlands, but it's pretty common these days that the European networks are being a bit lightened up and the culture institutes move to the territories where they need to fight some strategic struggles, I would say. So that's what we decided to do.
I know the Czech Centre in Moscow is currently on ice. Admirably, you're still running the Czech Centre in Kiev. How in practical terms, does that look?
Well, I'm always saying that entering this top-level management of culture diplomacy in these times is a challenge, but also really a privilege, because the times that we are operating in are really, really difficult ones. For the first time in decades, we are discussing here at the headquarters and implementing as well a means of physical and psychological support to some of our directors, namely, obviously, in Israel and then in Ukraine as well. And these are not the only ones. Tbilisi has become really a difficult location recently, and there are other ones. So we have just for the first time started a system of psychological support for my colleagues. They are obviously getting all the means of just support in their mission that they can, but still, and I would like to emphasize this, it really stands on the personal commitment that I would even call heroism of our directors in difficult locations, because they are obviously under enormous pressure.
But say in Kiev, is it open every day, or how does it work?
Well, so in Kyiv, as in many other locations, we don't have a building that would need to be open. It's the Czech Centre there is an institute, a hub of communication that organizes different events and communicates with local people in different ways. We are not bringing Czech artists there anymore because that would be risking too much. But the Czech Centre there, for instance, would facilitate study programs for young people that would, be a channel for studying Czech music, for instance. Or they organize programs for younger kids with Czech methodology in order to support them mentally. The concerts they have been holding by Ukrainian artists with some Czech repertoire have been running for some time in underground shelters, which, only testifies to the dramatic extent of the situation.
Prior to taking your current position, you were the head of the Czech Centre in Brussels for 5 or 6 years. How was that experience?
It was amazing. It was amazing. Brussels is such a thrilling place. It's the center of policymaking in the European Union. The audiences there are very diverse. Obviously, the so-called Brussels bubble, but also the French population, the Flemish-speaking population of Belgium, and so on and so forth. We also worked in Luxembourg. So it's been really interesting, especially because I was there also for the period of the Czech presidency, where I think I can proudly say that we, together with our partners, did a really good job in representing Czechia through arts and culture.
If I understand it correctly, when a post like that comes up, people who are interested, they submit ideas for what they would do if they were the head of the Czech Centre and budget proposals. But when they get the job, how much independence do they have, or autonomy, or do they have any autonomy?
Oh yeah, they do have significant autonomy, because the biggest raison d'être of these foreign culture institutes really is to kind of live with the local audience abroad. Our directors are selected on the basis of knowledge of the territory. Sometimes the pool is bigger when it's a large territory like the United States. Sometimes it's smaller when it's Georgia. But we always suppose that the director, he or her, would know and have a relationship towards the territory. And from that stems that we do want to provide them with really large autonomy, because their judgment as to what will work with the local audience is really paramount. On the other hand, though, we do have central or umbrella themes that we are kind of rolling throughout the network, if it makes sense, obviously. And these themes are forming a DNA of our programming and, of course, our kind of external visibility and identity. Next year, for instance, we will be celebrating the end of the Second World War, and obviously the question always with historical anniversaries is how pertinent this could be today. So the theme that we are working with next year is called Safe Space, and it's a theme of mental resilience and how culture can contribute to that. And this will be an umbrella theme for the whole network, but the directors themselves choose in which way exactly they will be working with it. Some of them have artistic residency, some of them have large debates, depends.
As you say, some positions may be relatively hard to fill in some territories. What's the maximum length of time a director can remain in place?
The standard really is 4 years. If they do a good job, they can be easily prolonged to by a year or two. However, there are some exceptions where for specific reasons our directors have been longer, and this is in 2, 3, maybe 4 countries.
This year, of course, has been the year of Czech music. During the year, Radio Prague International collaborated with the Czech Centres on a podcast. How has that whole project gone from your perspective?
Amazingly. And I'm especially happy to say so because I think this was an example of really good practice when multiple subjects of Czech public sector, right, had a similar theme. There was a budget dedicated to it. So we collaborated with the Arts Institute, the Theatre Institute, with many other, the National Museum and so on and so forth. And like this, we were able to put together really like beautiful and representative things outside of Czechia, including the tour of the Stromy ensemble with like contemporary allusions to Smetana and his genius and much, much more. So I'm super happy about the Year of the Czech Music. And my colleagues actually say the same.
And generally speaking, what are the areas of the arts that tend to resonate most with the public around the world?
Well, that would differ. There are obviously some areas for which we are proverbially known, such as Czech New Wave or Czechoslovak New Wave. That is very popular and my colleagues love to work with it around the world. However, we always kind of try to motivate them to add a contemporary layer to it. So for instance, when we are talking about Czechoslovak New Wave, we would be also talking about cinematography today, female directors and so on and so forth.
Also, I guess different directors would be popular in different territories.
Absolutely, absolutely. Schwankmajer is such a huge name in Japan, also for the Japanese love of animation in general, and other directors in other countries. We know that Daria Kashcheva won the Student Oscar in LA, so that would make her more popular in the USA, for instance.
A few years ago, you had a podcast called Jazzman versus Špioni, I guess jazz artist versus spies. That's an intriguing title. What's it all about?
The podcast really, and if I may, I will use this platform to recommend it to those who are interested in culture diplomacy in general, really is about culture diplomacy. It's logic, the thrilling stories that are behind it, and there are many, especially during the Cold War when culture diplomacy was one of the very few channels of how to communicate with foreign audiences, across the Iron Curtain. It was such an important platform to keep your contact. Unfortunately, in some ways, nowadays, it's the same. So the podcast really illustrates the history of culture diplomacy, including its little spy chapters, but also the trends that are happening today.
You say also that during the Cold War, the Americans sent out African-American jazz musicians as kind of cultural envoys, including here when, for example, Louis Armstrong played at Lucerna in 1965.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. And very interestingly, the whole jazz diplomacy was designed by the first Afro-American congressman, Adam Powell, who was at an international congress in Jakarta at the times when there was this very significant movement of unaligned countries, right? And he realized that the USA was losing the war for the hearts and minds of these countries. So he, together with his friends, including Duke Ellington, came up with this idea of using culture in a way that would be the closest to the hearts of the audiences they needed, including their African audiences. And it did play a significant role.
Well, I understand why they would try to appeal to non-aligned countries, but why would they be sending artists behind the Iron Curtain, basically to the other side, to countries like Czechoslovakia?
Well, because they needed to demonstrate that the American philosophy or a way of life is a very viable competition towards the one presented by the governing regime in the Eastern Bloc, right? So another example that I like to use is that the American Secret Services would throw copies of Orwell's Animal Farm down from balloons in Poland, exactly because they wanted to present the way of thinking, individualism, and other pillars of American or Western, let's say, identity in general to the audiences in the Soviet bloc.
If you look around the world, or at least around Europe, are there any countries that you consider masters at this kind of national branding?
Oh yeah, so many. Many of them in really different ways. I do like to follow the Korean institutes and the Korean culture diplomacy. They have set their targets pretty clearly years ago. Pop culture, film industry, cuisine, others as well. And they have just really pushed forward in these fields to amazing results. And they have been successful to really brand South Korea as a very contemporarily interesting country. So that's one example. Finland has been really great, and Scandinavian nations in general, they also know what they are doing ever since the 1960s. For them, the branding was also part of like reinvention of their societies after the Second World War. And not only they have managed to establish a really strong position of their design, but with it also a strong position of their ideas, including inclusivity and sustainability, for instance. Goethe Institute, it's such a good example. A very professional network of culture institutes with a very clear narrative and a very clear mission for Germany.
This leads me to the question, how good is Czechia in this area, or what more can you do?
I'm extremely happy about the infrastructure we have. It really is already amazing to have a really beautiful and professional network of culture institutes, almost 30, right, around the world. So this is such a great achievement that this has been established after the Velvet Revolution and is functioning and growing ever since. What we as Czechia in general are not great at is defining our strategic goals and really put our effort behind them. I do believe in general that for Czechia, culture diplomacy is such a strong tool because our culture credit around the world is really strong. We just need to be smart about it. So what we would need to do, I think, as a country is to postulate what our specific strategic visions are, what are our target audiences, and develop this, of course, within Czech Centres and, of course, within other public institutions that are active in this field, such as, once again, back to Scandinavia, the Team Finland effort that always postulates these goals for multiple institutions, and they work on those concurrently in their specific domains.
I saw an interview that you gave to Hlidací pes, the website, where you said you wanted the Czech Centres to take a more Havel-like approach to your work. What did you mean by that?
Well, Havel is just such an amazing example for our work in general because he was exactly what I think is the best practice of culture diplomacy. He had very strong ideas packed in a perfect, superb form that were relevant to international politics, right? So he knew what he was doing. He was able to articulate it beautifully in his theater pieces or his books. And these things were very valuable for Czech foreign politics. And all of these three pillars we should always include in our activities as well.
Is there any way for you to measure the success of cultural diplomacy?
Of course, there is, and we do. But so we have very precise quantitative measurements. We, of course, know how is the attendance of our events, if it's growing, who is going there, how is the social media response, how is the traditional media response, all of that we are mapping, putting down, how is the traffic of our website, right? On the other hand, we still haven't perfected our qualitative evaluation, and it's something I'm slowly working on because I would like to know more about, for instance, the development of the relationships that emerge through our events. How are the people translating the message they brought home to their further environment, and so on and so forth. There are studies internationally that deal with it. The conclusion always is it is a long-term run, long-term effort, but it is always worth it.
Many thanks indeed to Jitka Pánek Jurková for that interview. If you're new to the pod and enjoyed our conversation, why not look up some of the 100 plus earlier editions of Prague Talk, and of course subscribe wherever you get podcasts. But that's all for now for this edition of Prague Talk. From me, Ian Willoughby, thank you so much for listening, and talk to you again very soon.